A history of menstruation. Periods. Although over 50% of people have periods, the actual process of the uterine lining naturally shedding each month as part of fertility has long been hidden under stigma, shame, and mystery. Let's go back in time to observe how women have dealt with and been treated during that time of the month in different societies. The Latin and Greek terms for month and moon are the origin of the word menstruation. This is because, like the moon's 29.5-day orbit around the Earth, most women begin their menstrual cycles every 28 to 29 days. Because of this, a lot of ancient people thought that the phases of the moon were related to the menstrual cycles of women. Global mythology personifies the moon as a goddess, frequently endowed with fertility-related abilities. Greek goddess Selene encountered the Aztecs, as did the Roman Luna Abuk of the Dinka in South Sudan, Mayumo in Korean mythology, and Leona in Hawaii. Among the Incas, Mama Killa thought that menstruation was a punishment for the moon goddess, who had slept with the sun god. Her blood was reported to be kept in 13 jars and to have taken the form of diseases, snakes, insects, and poison. Men in ancient North and South America believed that the universe may end in chaos if women's menstruation wasn't closely observed and synced. Women in the past often had lighter periods and far fewer of them than we do today because pre-industrial societies had higher rates of illness and malnutrition. Women also had their first period later and menopause earlier, and without effective forms of birth control, women spent a much larger portion of their reproductive years pregnant and breastfeeding. For more information, watch my videos on the history of birth control and the history of pregnancy. Several recent studies have found a link between modern women's menstruation and the cycles of the moon, or that women living close to one another sync up when they menstrual. Although women in affluent nations today experience roughly 450 menstrual cycles, historically, women have resorted to using whatever was easily accessible and absorbent to manage their periods. This is seen in the Ebers Papyrus. The earliest known medical record, which dates to the 15th century BCE, mentions that Egyptian women made tampons out of supple papyrus rolls. Menstrual blood was also employed by the Egyptians as a cosmetic. They thought it helped raise skin and sagging breasts. Hippocrates, the Greek physician, told of women who made tampons by wrapping lamb's wool or lint around lightweight absorbent wood. Another theory is that sea sponge was employed. The first paper was created in China in 105 AD, and it was brought to Japan in the 6th century. Tampons were made by women in ancient Japan by rolling up paper and using bandages to keep them in place. Hawaiian ladies made use of the local happy fern's fuzzy portion. In equatorial Africa, women utilized rolls of grass, and in Indonesia, they used vegetable fibers. Pads made of buffalo leather and moss were fashioned by Native American women. The Cherokee thought that menstruation blood could destroy their foes and was a source of great feminine strength. Roman, the philosopher Pliny the Elder claimed that if a lady going through her period went about a field in her undies, insects would drop off the crops and she might frighten off lightning, whirlwinds, and hailstorms. Pliny also mentioned that a menstrual woman's touch might sour wine, dull a razor, and turn linen black. Arithmetic expert once, a male student made romantic advances toward the philosopher and astronomer Hypatia of Alexandria. Despite her repeated attempts to show him that she was uninterested, she finally threw her bloody minstrel rags at him and said, "This is what you really love, my young man, but you do not love beauty for its own sake." He was so incensed that he immediately gave up and left Hippocatia in peace. Men have historically used menstruation as a means of maintaining gender inequality in various societies by viewing it with distaste and applying that unsavory emotion to all women. A woman who is on her period is referred to as nida in the Hebrew Torah and is considered ritually unclean. Her spouse is unclean if he touches her, and everything she touches becomes infected as well. These laws are still observed by Orthodox Jews, although most other religions do not. Hindu husbands were also told not to touch their women while they were menstruating because doing so could result in the birth of wicked children. Menstruating women are still required to stay in one room in many traditional and rural houses. They are also required to miss job and school during this period. 3 days later, ladies take a ceremonial bath known as a ritus nana. To guarantee conception, they should then have sex with their husbands right away. Although some did not view menstruation as the bane of women, the 3rd century Pope Dionysius of Alexandria claimed that pious women would not dare approach the holy table while in that state. As a result, women in the Coptic, Russian, and Greek Orthodox churches frequently refrain from receiving communion or going to church while they are menstruating. The founder of Sikhism, Guru Nanak, denounced the custom of viewing women as unclean when they were menstruating in the 15th century. He imparted the knowledge that the menstrual cycle is a divine gift and necessary for the genesis of human existence. Buddhism has an equally enlightened perspective. Albeit menstruation, women are free to decide not to bow during prayers if doing so would bring them peace and well-being. Purchasing. The idea that women in biblical times gathered together while they menstruated and gave birth in a tent, apart from the rest of the tribe, became popularized by Anita Diamond's historical novel, The Red Tent. They bonded, comforted, and carried out occult rites together. Although it would have been a sensible precaution to prevent infecting the entire hamlet, there is no evidence that women of the biblical era gathered in menstrual tents, but Diamond didn't make the red tent out of whole cloth. When a native European woman in California went through her menstrual cycle, she would refuse to cook for her husband or do household chores for 10 days because she was at the peak of her power. It was believed that she shouldn't waste her time on menial tasks, distractions, or worries about the opposite sex, but instead should devote all of her energies to meditation. Women all over the world have turned taboos to their advantage by going on strike from sex and domestic chores and even retiring to menstrual tents, huts. She would move into a minstrel hut in the mountains with other women in the community, and together they would bathe and perform rituals in the sacred Moontime Pond. It was recorded that all women in the community menstruated at the same time, and that if a woman fell out of sync with her sisters, she could mask the moon to balance her. The community minstrel house, or bashali, is referred to the women in the Kalashan Valley of northwest Pakistan as their most sacred location. The biggest structure in the town center, it is constantly crowded with ladies chatting, laughing, singing, giving birth, and exchanging advice. The women bring their infants and small children with them. But among the hunter-gatherers of the Ituri forest in eastern Congo, men are not allowed in the bashali. There is a lot of gender equality. They joyfully and festively commemorate a young woman's first menstruation. The Alama hut, a sizable temple in the middle of the neighborhood, is shown to her. Inside, older women teach her classic melodies and offer her real lessons about boys and sex. As soon as the girls are free, they set out to playfully chase after boys with large whipping sticks. When a boy experiences his first menstruation, he has to try to get past the older women and into the Alama hut, if he gets lashed. When their menstrual cycle ends, young Aboriginal women in Australia reside in menstrual huts constructed by their moms. The cottage burns down while they take a swim in the river. Menstrual separation has been appropriated by numerous patriarchies over time as a means of further oppressing women. In the Ethiopian highlands, Jewish women are still required to spend 7 days in a hut. They are only permitted to prepare coffee and roasted grains. Regarding the practice, these ladies express varying emotions. While some talk of dread, the cold, and hunger, others just love socializing and unwinding. During their menstrual cycle, Hindu women in Western Nepal are required to spend 5 days living in tiny, windowless cottages known as chiopati. First-time menstruation girls had to spend at least 14 days in the hut. Numerous women and girls die in menstruation huts every year from assault, suffocation from a lack of air, freezing temperatures, and snake bites. This practice also causes young women to miss numerous school days. Although the Supreme Court of Nepal banned the use of menstrual cottages in 2005, the rule was not strictly followed. The dubious medical practice of bloodletting originated from the belief that blood carried toxins throughout the Middle Ages in Europe. Drinking menstrual blood was thought to spread leprosy since it was highly polluted. Women who experienced very painful periods were given herbal medicines by midwives, but these remedies were kept very confidential and were never documented because the medieval church taught that monthly cramps and discomfort were women's retribution for Eve's original sin, just as the misery of childbirth. Most women's undergarments were exposed to the elements beneath their thick layers of skirts because it was considered solely masculine and unseemly for women to wear pants. It would have taken a lot of effort to reach under all those petticoats in order to replace a feminine hygiene item. Women had to come up with inventive ways to deal with that time of the month. Some bled freely into their chemise or moved the one piece of clothing that was frequently laundered, a linen slip worn next to the skin. Others used old rags to create belts or diaper-like garments. The rags needed to be soaked, manually cleaned, and reused after each use because cloth was expensive and labor-intensive to create. Gynecologists who were men took over the field in the late 1700s, distancing themselves from the traditional midwives and portraying them as filthy and uneducated. These doctors were now responsible for women's health, yet they showed little interest in learning more about it. Instead than asking women about their personal experiences, the medical establishment made many assumptions and educated guesses. Bloomers were voluminous undergarments that were crotchless and popularized in the early 1800s, allowing women to urinate without taking off their layers of skirts and corsets. The Hoosier sanitary belt was invented in the late 1800s. Although it was an improvement over loose rags and diapers, it was still chunky and uncomfortable. Manufacturers didn't bother to come up with anything better, so they remained in common use until the 1970s. Women used to pin strips of cotton and flannel into the gap to absorb their menstruation. In the 1850s, sanitary aprons or strips of rubber worn between the legs were used to prevent clothes from staining. However, the bacteria trapped in these materials worsened odor and caused rashes and infections. By the late 1800s, more women were working, going to college, and demanding the right to vote. Men who were against women's advancement tried to use menstruation as a scientific justification for not allowing them to participate equally in society. According to Dr. James McGregor Allen, men have always outperformed women in intellectual labor because nature does not constantly interfere with their ability to think and apply themselves. John Harvey Kellogg, a health reformer and cornflakes fanatic, advised ladies to take it easy during menstruation. According to Harvard medical professor Edward Clark, a female's intellect and body would not be able to withstand the demands of a college degree. He proposed that ladies should stay at home and lie in bed during their periods instead than standing in lecture halls, since gravity would draw too much blood from their brains during this time. He cautioned wealthy families against sending their daughters to college for fear that they would become infertile. It's noteworthy to notice that nobody was advocating for working-class women to promote misogynistic pseudoscience during their periods instead of spending them relaxing in bed. On the subject, Dr. Mary Putnam Jacoby carried out an investigation. She observed women during their menstrual cycles and gathered a wealth of physiological data, including tests of muscular strength. Her research was published in a groundbreaking 1876 study in which she stated that women were healthy when they were educated, mentally stimulated, and physically active, and that there is nothing inherent in the nature of menstruation to suggest the need for or the desire for rest. Not only did Jacoby scientifically disprove Clark's claims, she was awarded the Boylston Medical Prize from Clark's University in Harvard. Unfortunately, this hard science did not put an end to the taboos surrounding menstruation during World War I. Nurses discovered that cellucotton, a type of cheap bandage made out of wood pulp, worked miraculously well for absorbing their periods. After the war, the private sector repackaged the bandages that were stored in warehouses. When Kotex disposable pads were first introduced in 1920, there was a slow uptake. Going into a drugstore and asking for anything for their periods made women feel ashamed. Shops arranged tables with Kotex in simple brown packaging so that ladies could covertly take out their requisites and leave a nickel in the jar, thereby perpetuating the notion that they ought to feel embarrassed about their periods. When Kotex began to show up for purchase by order in the 1926 Montgomery Ward catalog, people began to take notice of them. The style of the 1920s and 1930s saw a sharp shift from large skirts that could readily hide a thick belt and menstrual pad to short, form-fitting skirts that could not. Actress Leona Chalmers created the first menstruation cup, known as the Tasset, around the same time as tampons were introduced to the market. However, neither product took off because it was commonly thought that using either would compromise a woman's sexual purity at a period when female virginity was still highly valued. These goods were only advertised to married women. During that time of the month, young ladies were forced to wear big belts, plan outfits that fit better, and refrain from swimming in order to keep their condition a secret from others. The pill was authorized in 1957 to aid women with severe menstrual abnormalities and to regulate their menstrual cycles. Unusually high numbers of women started reporting severe menstruation abnormalities, not as a contraceptive. Stafford debuted the first adhesive pad, known as the Maxi Pad, in 1969, and it became popular right away. Ladies were ecstatic to have greater freedom to wear and move around, and to finally get rid of those hideous belts that had been around for a century. After the market for new feminine hygiene products started to flourish, advertising shifted their messaging to try and persuade women that using tampons had nothing to do with being a virgin. Courtney Cox used the word period for the first time on American television in this 1985 Tampax commercial. Women nowadays are searching for novel approaches to make their menstruation even more comfortable and less bothersome. The goal of birth control tablets and IUDs is to make periods lighter and less frequent for women. Both absorbent, reusable underpants and menstrual cups are returning to popularity. Compared to disposable pads and tampons, both are significantly more ecologically friendly and offer financial savings. Proponents have drawn attention to the unfairness of the taxes that many nations impose on the purchase of feminine hygiene products, given the high cost of other essentials like tampons and exempt pads, which many women and girls struggle to afford and frequently miss work and school if they are unable to. Menstruation is seen as something shameful that should be kept private in both developed and developing nations. Women are prevented from discussing their periods and are given more insight into what they are going through, including what degree of pain and other symptoms are typical. When a woman has endometriosis, it typically takes her 8 years to receive a diagnosis, since she and her physician may not be aware that her symptoms are unusual. Furthermore, men's ignorance about menstruation contributes to the spread of several myths and frequently permits them to minimize women's emotions just because they are experiencing menstruation. Women are overcoming the taboos surrounding menstruation and talking about it more openly as they have more possibilities to participate in conversations and take ownership of their period. Industry, science, and medical professionals are creating fresh, improved solutions to help us cope with that time of the month. Ultimately, we just needed a few thousand years to obtain something superior to a rag. That's it for today. Remember to support. Please subscribe.